I hope you had a lovely lunch, and you've taken some seconds as well, because there seems to be quite a bit left over, so hopefully you're not feeling shy about having seconds for that. And I hope you enjoyed the sunshine outside as well. It was good, wasn't it? It falls to me to introduce Karen O'Donnell to you, Dr. Karen O'Donnell. I am not going to tell you anything that you can easily find on Google about Karen, but she has ended up with the slots that traditionally people start to have a post-lunch doze. So let me tell you this about Karen. Karen's book, The Dark Womb, I read a couple of years ago, and that was the one book that substantially changed my understanding of Easter Saturday and what went on at Easter. And that was a very profound experience for me. So it's my absolute privilege to introduce Karen to you.
Thank you. I often delight in taking the opportunity to speak about trauma, which is my primary research area. But I'm not going to do that today, but I will plug the trauma books at the back there. I am going to talk today about women's bodies in Christianity. And I want to offer a tiny little content warning. There will be a brief reference to pregnancy loss during my talk, but I won't be dwelling on it. Throughout its history, Christianity has been bad for women's bodies, and it has exercised patriarchal limits upon them. Christianity has been bad for women's autonomy, women's agency, women's flourishing, and women's flesh. For centuries, the male body has been associated with the spiritual, the divine, the pure. If you want to make spiritual progress, if you want to seek after God, women need to cut their hair and don male clothing, like Thicc did when she followed after the Apostle Paul. They need to fast to the extent that their breasts shrink and their periods stop, thus making them a bit more like men. Women's bodies are leaky, messy, and uncontrollable. They are earthly, material. They are not, in this tradition, spiritual and holy. They ooze blood and milk. They are noisy and emotional. They are dangerous and impure. This dichotomy is so well known in feminist theological writing that it's almost a bit of a joke, a bit of misogynistic historical nonsense. However, I'm going to argue that this kind of thinking, as well as being a feature of the tradition, is alive and well in the Christian world today. I'm going to talk a little bit about my own experience as a fat, emotional, infertile woman in the Christian church. And I'm going to talk about the ways in which Christianity subtly and not so subtly teaches women to hate and fear their bodies. I'm going to talk about the ways in which exceeding these limits of fecundity, affect, and fleshliness are categorized as sinful, but might actually be radical dispositions. And so I'm going to offer an encounter with the Shulamite woman of the Song of Songs and argue that a body-loving sensual revolution is necessary in Christianity in order that women might flourish. In biblical texts, barrenness, infertility, is a curse for women. Women are supposed to be fertile, they're supposed to produce children. Children, after all, are a gift from God. So what does it say about you if you've not received that gift? Nothing good, I fear. The value of a woman at this time, maybe even today, was greatly enhanced by the production of a child. And we see this very clearly in the narrative of Hannah in the Hebrew Bible. An ancient story narrated in the 6th century BCE. Hannah's is the most fully rendered account of a barren woman in the Hebrew Bible. Alexandra Kimball, in her non-religious secular book called The Seed, Infertility is a Feminist Issue, writes about this story of Hannah. She says, Hannah's response to her own infertility is almost a parody of appropriate feminine submission. She prays silently, she denies herself food and drink, and she submits immediately to the orders of the male priest, who is her only human counsel. It's as if she's trying to redeem her deviance, her failure as a woman, by doubling down on her femininity. emphasizing her submissiveness and obedience to male authority. When God eventually opens her womb, Kimball says, it's partly in response to Hannah's prayer, but also to reward her for her feminine virtue. 800 years later, Jerome writes a letter to Eustochium, and he advises her that she should be surrounded by ladies in waiting who are pale and thin with fasting. In his later letter to Paula, whose daughter Blasilla has just died, he writes of Blasilla, whom he praises for her dedication to fasting, that her steps tottered with weakness, her face was pale and quivering, her slender neck scarcely upheld her head. These are the feminine virtues that received his praise. Fasting to the point of death, thin, weak, pale, and quivering. Moving forward 1,000 years, with a very unhelpful picture of Margery Kemp here, because she was probably illiterate and didn't do her own writing, but just use your imagination. Moving forward 1,000 years to the early 15th century, Margery Kemp lived in Bishop's Lynn in East Anglia. And although she is now recognised as an important figure in English mysticism and in English literature, at the time she was basically a real pain in the bum for local clergy. She was a crier. Her frequent weeping often disrupted services. Her mystical visions provoked public displays of loud wailing, sobbing, and writhing, which frightened and annoyed lay people and clergy alike. She was tried for heresy a number of times, but never convicted. She challenged and exceeded the prescribed limits and behavioral norms for women, and that made her a danger and an irritation to the church. Women should be quiet, their weeping should be dainty and private. Fertile, slim, and serene. The Christian tradition is full of narratives such as these, both in the scriptures and in the narratives of Christian history. Women should produce children. They are at their most spiritual when they are slender, faint, and weak. They should be quiet in public, certainly not overly emotional. But this is not simply a historical narrative of the way things have been. It is also the way things still are. Things I did not know were wrong with my body. I spent 14 years in conservative, charismatic, evangelical Christianity in the UK. It's been nearly 13 years since I left, and I know I am still unpicking and recovering from the damage my participation in this particular kind of Christianity did to my body. I became a Christian and joined this local evangelical church when I was 14. Participating in youth groups and summer camps, I quickly learned that my developing female body needed to be covered up. I needed to protect my male friends from my body, just in case they were tempted to sin. So I covered up, and I made sure I never got too bouncy in worship. Heaven forbid somebody saw my boobs. My body was a problem. My body caused other people to sin, and in doing so, it became even more sinful itself. During this time, 2000s, 2010s, diet culture amongst women in the church was everywhere. Fatness implicitly indicated sinfulness. Various books made the rounds of church women. Free to be Thin told us that being fat was not living in the freedom Christ had given us. I had a really good lunch. As a whole church, we read a book called The Bondage Breaker by Neil Anderson and worked through the Freedom in Christ course, which made it clear that flesh was evil. Being overly emotional was a sin, and being fat was about being in bondage to a spirit of a bad habit that needed to be cast out of my body. My fat body was evidence of my sin. When the time came to get pregnant and produce some babies, my body did not comply. After a series of pregnancy losses, including a life-threatening ectopic pregnancy that resulted in the loss of one of my fallopian tubes in emergency surgery, I was broken. Desperate to get pregnant, and fearful of what it might happen to my body, and terrified of what would happen if I didn't get pregnant. The message from the church was clear. I must keep trying. I must pursue getting pregnant at all costs. An older church friend had suffered 17 miscarriages in her pursuit of having her 2 children. Infertility was not an option. And of course, it was me, not my husband, that was expected to fix this problem. I was demonstrably emotional after these experiences, and I think that's quite reasonable. I burst into tears regularly. I found attending church very distressing. I was angry and I was unhappy. I was incredibly sad and frustrated. And I'd never been, even in the best of times, good at presenting a calm and serene figure of a Christian wife, even before this period of pregnancy losses. I wore my heart on my sleeve. My now ex-husband had been chastised to get better control of me when my emotions were too visible for the men who led our church. These uncontrollable emotions were a sign of my own imbalance, my unreliability, the problem that was Karen. Exacerbated by the devastation of losing pregnancies and the intense pressure to get pregnant, I became like Marjorie, one who burst into tears all the time, a loud and ugly crier. Unsurprisingly, you'll be pleased to know I ended up leaving the church, and I've spent the last decade recovering. My body is still fat, emotional, and infertile. It had pushed up against and exceeded the limits for female flesh in this kind of Christianity. So what does this account of my own experience reveal? Well, it taught me that my body was something to be feared, controlled, concealed, and suppressed. It reinforced the idea that my body was supposed to be quiet, slim, and fertile. The overriding impression was that my body had exceeded these limits, and it was sinful and bad and not to be trusted. If the things women, and indeed all those who do not fit into patriarchal norms of white, male, cisgendered, able-bodied, straight, neurotypical bodies, if the things women experience in their bodies, and indeed their bodies themselves, are not to be trusted and are connected with sin, then this has, I argue, an effect on limiting our theological imaginations. It makes us less. I confess that when I wrote this paper, I was racking my brains for a biblical woman who might offer an example of one who loves her body and what it teaches her. Such women are thin, no pun intended, on the ground, not only in Scripture, but also in the Christian tradition. And whilst we encounter many interesting women worthy of our reflection, I think there are few that we can claim as loving and trusting their bodies. So, I turn to the Shulamite woman in the Song of Songs. Might she be our friend in imagining a body-loving, sensuous revolution in Christianity? Renita Weems notes that this woman is headstrong, passionate, gutsy, willing to risk the disapproval of those around her in order to pursue her own fullness. The inclusion of the Song of Songs in the Christian biblical canon gives us some space to think again about how we image women, their bodies and sex in this unapologetically erotic and sensuous poetry. The poem gives us opportunity to redeem emotion, sex and pleasure, sex for pleasure rather than procreation, and fatness in the Christian discourse. The redemption of the emotional woman through this text is perhaps obvious. The Shulamite is passionate, she's dramatic, she's vociferous in the expression of her thoughts, her friendships, her love, and her desires. There's no reproach in the text. Nobody tells her to be quiet. Nobody tells her that her emotions are not to be trusted. Rather, the things she feels are celebrated. After her first lusty speech, in which she desires both kisses and hurrying to her lover's bedchambers, her friends say, "We rejoice and delight in you. We praise your love more than wine." There's no silencing here, but rather a group of female friends, sometimes referred to as the Daughters of Jerusalem, that remind me of a noisy, bottomless brunch where talk of a lover is celebrated even more than wine. In her other relationships, the Shulamite woman is similarly emotional, although this is not always celebrated. She is, it is easy to forget, a younger sister of brothers as well as a lover. Indeed, immediately after her lush and lusty introduction in the first verses of the text, she expresses her annoyance with her brothers. My mother's sons were angry with me. They made me keeper of the vineyards. She's frustrated. Her brothers appear again towards the end of the song, and there's animosity here. They're hostile towards her, and she is angry about it. They try and quiet her, keep her subdued in the vineyards, but she will not be silenced. She literally refuses to be walled up by her brothers, and with remarkable vitality in the face of vulnerability, she persists in flipping the brothers' script and affirms her own identity. My vineyard, my very own, is for myself. She asserts her sense of self, and that comes with a deep range of emotions that will not be silenced or tamed or made appropriate for polite company. She also, though, speaks to the redemption of the sexual woman, the redemption of sex for pleasure, of desire for one's lover just for their own sake and not for procreation. She is a lusty woman who greatly desires sexual encounters with her lover. She's unmarried and really aroused by her partner. I find this hilarious when it's a text that's often chosen for the marriage service. It's not really about marriage at all. She says, my beloved thrust his hand into the opening, and my inmost being yearned for him. I arose to open to my beloved. My hands dripped with myrrh, my fingers with liquid myrrh. Beautiful poetic language describing how aroused her lover had made her. Furthermore, this unmarried woman is not desiring sex so she can become pregnant. Virginia Burrus and Stephen Moore note that the song has been stripped of its traditional matrimonial framework and reconstructed as a celebration of unmarried love and lust with no wedding veil in sight and no apparent intent to procreate. Indeed, it is not sexual acts for procreation that the Shulamite is interested in. She tells her friends that the fruit of her lover is sweet to the taste, referring, one might imagine, to oral sex. She says, like an apple tree among the trees of the forest is my beloved among the young men. I delight to sit in his shade, and his fruit is sweet to my taste. Chapter 5 of the song offers from both the lover and the beloved references to both oral sex and masturbation, neither of which are likely to get one pregnant. The lover tells us that he has come into my garden, my sister, my bride, the garden, a often used synonym for vagina, gathered my myrrh with my spice, I've eaten my honeycomb and my honey, I have drunk my wine and my milk. She goes on to say, my beloved thrust his hand through the latch opening, my heart began to pound for him. Her own fingers drip with myrrh, perhaps a reference to pleasuring herself while she waits for him. Fertility is irrelevant in the song. No one, including the lovers themselves, is interested in her ability to bring forth children. The sex acts the lovers engage in are not procreative, and in fact the whole text has been read as a discourse in edging that brings no immediate completion. So the Shulamite is then perhaps emotionally and sexually liberated. But what about fatness? We have plenty of descriptions of the Shulamite, and they are very well known to be quite odd in their metaphors and similes. And I don't want to make a case that she was fat. How would we know? But she is certainly body positive. She's comfortable with her own body, and she trusts her gut instincts, what her body tells her. She affirms her black comeliness. She says in the first chapter, I am black and beautiful, against the comments of the daughters of Jerusalem, and she pushes back against her brother's comments that say, when they say she has no breasts. In chapter 8, verse 8, for some reason the brothers go, we have a little sister and she has no breasts. 2 verses later she says, my breasts were like towers. She tells her lover that her body is a bountiful feast that she's going to give to him. Her own embodiment pleases her. She is self-confident and body celebratory. So can we imagine the Shulamite woman as one who is fat, at least metaphorically? Because she is liberated and passionate, she's not limited and controlled, but rather living into the fullness of her body. In this encounter with the Shulamite woman, we find a glimpse of a strand within Christian tradition that might offer women some hope. Here we find the celebration of an emotional, fat, unmarried woman who wants to have passionate sex with her lover because she loves him. Here we find a different story, a body-loving story. And I suggest that we might want to claim the Shulamite as one of our own and allow her passion to ignite some kind of body-loving revolution in our own bodies. Thick thighs save lives. For women talking about their bodies with pride, thick, Thicc, is a positive, sexy assessment of a fuller figure. It's a body positivity phrase that functions in resistance to sexist, racist, and colonialist attitudes that rely on something like the body mass index as an indication of health. Bodies don't fit into these kinds of scales. A thick theology, then. By this, I mean theologies that have a fuller figure, theologies that enable abundant, embodied living, theologies that attend holistically and liberatively to embodied experiences, resisting patriarchy, resisting coloniality, resisting the tradition. Theologies that are proud of our bodies, seeing them as places in which we encounter God and not inherently as places of sin. Theologies that recognize things like breastfeeding, menstruation, menopause, masturbation, birth, and emotions are all things worthy of theological attention. This is a thick theology. The Shulamite offers us the foundations for this kind of thinking. She stretches out her myrrh-dripping fingers and anoints our theological attempts with the slick essence of her own body. She stretches out scriptural space for women to be happy and be Christian in their own bodies, full of emotions, liberated in her own incarnational fleshness, and seeking pleasure for the sake of pleasure and intimacy. The Shulamite woman marks out the landscape of thick theologies with raisins and apples and pomegranates. Like the Shulamite woman in the Song of Songs, we can learn to embrace the passionate, exuberant, sensuous nature of ourselves as entirely spiritual, because spiritual is not opposition to fleshly and material. Alongside a bigger and more abundant imagining of the incarnation, rejecting the ways in which corporeal limitations have been written onto Christian women's bodies for so many centuries, I argue instead that our theologies need to be fatter, more fleshly, more emotional, more embodied. If thick thighs save lives, maybe thick theologies will do too.